Police who have encountered sovereign citizens. What's your best story? My uncle calls himself one. But it's kinda funny, because he refuses to work, expects family and the US government to cough up money, or housing whenever he gets tired of living under a bridge. And he's super into big government. He just doesn't want to pay the consequences of it. I think he's confused. Prosecutor, not a cop, but I have seen a couple of these idiots in court. One guy insisted on representing himself despite the judge's constant pleas that he accept a public defender. He submitted documents to the court that were signed with his thumbprint in his own blood. Literally cannot make this up. During jury selection he would ask a question and then spin around and look at the judge to see if she was going to shut him down. He repeatedly asked/said things you can't during jury selection. That whole trial was a train wreck. He testified in his own defense and said he wasn't born in New York like his birth certificate said, but instead in Northwest Africa. So I at least gave him props for getting the direction right if we are including New York as part of Africa. He was on trial for a suspended license and weed, so this was also much ado about nothing. He got convicted. The second one I saw started out way more reasonable. He did his own jury selection like the other guy, but was way more prepared and seemed like he'd been there before. I was actually pretty impressed for a while, until he testified. So since he was representing himself, he didn't have an attorney to ask him questions when he testified like usual. In these situations, typically the person just gives a monologue about their side of the story. Not this guy. He stood at the podium, asked a question, then walked to the witness stand, sat down, and answered it. Then he got up, went back to the podium, asked a question, rinse, lather, repeat. He seemed fairly normal, if a little deluded until that happened, and then we realized he was full on crazy, just better at hiding it. He also got convicted for a suspended license and having a concealed weapon. He carried a huge hunting knife on himself at all times. Lawyer here. I once faced off against one in court. He asked the master of the courts to override the Supreme Court of Canada. When the master wouldn't do that, our freeman tried to convince him to disbar me, saying that I'm not really an attorney. This was quite funny because in Canada we don't call lawyers attorneys. He later filed an affidavit claiming that he was a former client of mine and thus I was acting in conflict of interest. Crazy. I've been very lucky, knock on wood, to not have had to deal with many. I'm currently being sued by a sovereign citizen through an unrecognized as legitimate court, but so is every other person in the 100+ department, so I'm not just real concerned about it. He just decided to sue everybody. Cause it works like that, I guess. Even cops like me, who have never even seen him, or knew who he was. The only other time I dealt with one was a very mild interaction in comparison to the ones you see on YouTube. I pulled a guy over for either expired tag or no tag. Can't remember now. I was like a first year rookie. He was very odd throughout the whole thing. Didn't have his license on him. Used some alternate word like convey in place of driving. Like we were conveying to the store. Classic sign of sovereign citizen. When I asked him for his birthday he said, I don't know. So of course I'm like WTF. Yes you do. What is it? He goes, all I know is what I've been told. What? I can't remember anything about the day I was born. All I know is what people have told me. I thought about it for a second and was kind of amused, lol. I was thinking, well shit. What if my mom has been lying to me this whole time about what day I was born on? She totally could have pulled it off. I wouldn't have known any different, lol. It's not like that old worn out birth certificate from the 80s is the most reputable looking document anyway. Joking, of course. Though I'll never know for sure. I finally had to go the route of asking, okay, fine. When were you told you were born? And he immediately spit out a birthday. That was mostly what I remember from it. I cited him for something, and as I'm telling him the ticket information, he kept interrupting me saying thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you just over and over. I finally just said fuck it and quit talking. Gave him his ticket and he left. I think he was still a sovereign citizen in training, lol. Obligatory, not a police officer, but there was a security guard at the gym where I worked out in college, who I became friends with. She told me that her grandmother, who was easily over 100 years old, was a sovereign citizen. Her best story was the time she decided to bring grandma with her to the DMV so she could get a new license. She left grandma in the waiting room and went up to the counter, only to smell faint smoke a few minutes later. She turns around and sees her grandmother, this tiny gnarled black woman who was maybe 90 pounds, soaking wet, fucking toking up in the middle of the DMV. A small crowd has formed around her in shock. When the cops show up, she tries to pull the sovereign citizen shtick on them, which doesn't work. The cops, who aren't sure what to do with a pothead so old that she'd probably die on the way to the station, just kick her and the security guard out. Security guard didn't get a license. Another time, the guard decides she's going to go out clubbing, and Granny demands that she comes with her. While they're out, the guard loses sight of grandma and searches frantically for her in this dark, loud bar. Eventually, she encounters a guy who says that Granny and his friend went to the motel across the street. The security guard tracks them down and finds out her grandma is soliciting this 20-year-old guy for sex and offers to pay him $100 and weed in the lobby of the motel. The motel owner calls the cops, who show up completely bewildered at the situation. Again, no arrests are made. The security guard just takes grandma home. Yeah. I'm in the UK and have encountered some in my job in mortgages. I'm in the complaints department. We regularly get letters from customers stating obtuse sailing laws from the 18th century that mean that the UK loan system is illegal. Also, we get given a bit of paper that states this document is a bill of pound XXXXX. You have to legally take this to clear my mortgage. No we don't. We get claims that without providing signed original paperwork, which we don't hold, it's all electronic, the mortgage is invalid. The list goes on. They call themselves Bob or the Family Smith. I just sigh when I see the letters now. One of my friends considers himself a sovereign citizen. I usually zone out when he's explaining some old maritime law or whatever that makes him exempt from everything he doesn't like. Honestly, nothing's really different between him and my other friends except for the fact that he's got a rap sheet like 3 pages long full of simple trespassing and stuff because you can't own land, man, or whatever the hell. I'm not police, but I work in local government and we have a few of these people. One in particular routinely sends certified letters stating that the US Constitution does not require her to be a part of the US, and that local government can therefore not require her to pay taxes or anything. She routinely sends subpoenas for people to appear in her court to answer for violations of things. The really creepy part is she also puts a thumbprint in blood as her signature. I work drug interdiction on a major interstate in the southeast and deal with these delusional people much more often than I care to. One story in particular is a young man out of Tennessee that my partner stopped, and I arrived to find him refusing to exit his car. My partner is much more patient than I and is trying to reason with the guy, explaining that despite his ambitious arguments that we have no jurisdiction or authority over him, if he doesn't comply and produce identification, that he will be arrested. He eventually agrees to step out of the car and I take him off the shoulder of the road and begin to talk with him as my partner starts running checks and doing his enforcement action. The guy didn't produce a license for my partner, but did provide a name and DOB that needed up being fictitious. The guy tells me that he is a foreign dignitary from the Israel International Army, that he is not subject to our state's jurisdiction, and rattles off the typical sovereign BS. He then pulls out a Israel National Army identification card that is hilariously poor quality and starts describing his assigned duties and objectives as an operative for this fictional group of idiots. I notice that the card he has handed me is a little frayed on the edge and the lamination is loose, so I gently lift up on the laminate and reveal that his ID from this group is printed on computer paper and wrapped around an Ingalls Advantage card. I have a good chuckle, and we end up arresting the guy for obstruction for providing the false name, as his vehicle is registered in his true name and our system pops up a nice big picture of the registered owner with their full info. With 10 years of law enforcement experience and countless interactions with these people, I'm still fascinated with their level of ignorance and stupidity. Not a cop, but I'm a criminal defense attorney, specifically a public defender. I deal with sovereign citizens frequently in my line of work, so I'll share some of my experiences. I've had to represent several sovereign citizens, and they are endlessly hilarious to deal with. My favorite way to cool their jets is to let them finish their anti-government rant, and then say something like this to them. Okay, let's assume for a minute that everything you just told me was correct, which it wasn't, but let's assume anyway. Even if the government has no jurisdiction over you, the fact of the matter is that the judge has a literal personal army of sheriff's deputies that will do whatever he tells them to do. If you resist them, they'll use their jails, their guns, their tasers, their handcuffs, and their batons to help you comply. And when they're done doing all that to you, absolutely no one will tell the judge that he couldn't have done that. Nobody. So, that said, let's limit our discussion to the rules that the judge wants us to play by, because otherwise he's going to force us to play by them, and there's nothing we can do about it. That usually helps bring them back to reality fairly quickly. Since I've represented so many of them, I've also taken the time to read their handbook, Title 4 Flag Says Your Schwag, which is the most nonsense-laden book I've ever read. Not only does it entirely misunderstand and misapply the law, it's also filled with downright falsehoods and lies straight out of its author's imaginary fantasy world. If you want to read it for yourself, you can either pay $25 for it on Amazon, or you can download it for free in PDF form without paying its author a penny. I suggest the latter, given that he doesn't believe in our government. It stands to reason he doesn't believe in our government's copyright system either. That said, despite the ocean of bullshit inside of its pages, there is one section to it that's absolutely true. That part is the section that says you shouldn't have a state licensed attorney represent you, because no attorney licensed by the state will give the arguments in that book out of fear of being disbarred. That, my friends, is the only true statement in the book. Police here, verified on /r/protect and serve. I've never encountered a full-blown sovereign citizen, but a lot of people act like they are until they find out they are getting handcuffs and a trip to jail if they cannot satisfactorily identify themselves. Quite a few people have had success in the past pulling those moves and the cop going, "I'm not dealing with this today," and going free, so they make the gamble. Those cops just make it harder for the rest of us. Oddly enough, this doesn't end terribly. I seem to be in a rare experience. In 2008 I worked a 1-year contract at my then local town's police detachment as an admitting guard, civilian, mostly paperwork, for the jail cells. 95% of the time is drunks to sleep it off. When I was on shift and the cells were empty, small town, I made an effort to clean them, hose them down, use proper cleaning chemicals and set up a mat or two for the next occupants. Around the fall the officers brought in a highway arrest. I can hear the radio chatter from my office, and was familiar with the codes by then. The guy was driving an unregistered vehicle, no insurance, no license, multiple warrants out for similar offenses, obstruction of justice, petty crimes, bunch of other minor moderate things, as well as a warning tag that the subject was known for aggression against police. They bring the guy in. He's somewhat uncooperative, but far from the worst I have seen. He placed in one of my freshly cleaned cells, where he promptly sits down. He later requests, politely, a magazine to read, which I provide, an older National Geographic. Within a few hours the paperwork is processed. He has read the book, and is fully cooperative. I suspect nothing at this point. The officers draw up the release papers, a promise to appear, which of course we already have an inkling is not going to be followed through on. I prepare the release notes, and then the guy says this to me: "I'm a freeman of the land, we don't believe in government." Normally when these guy nods to the officers, take me away, I make a point of causing as much noise, banging and disrupting as much as I can. I didn't do that today. Because you gave me a clean cell. You showed me an ounce of respect, so I have to show it back by being cooperative, and now I'm out of here in record time. Thank you. At the time I had never encountered that before. I was floored. The officers were speechless for a moment. I'll never know what was going through that guy's head, and I still can't quite make sense of it, especially as I read all of the disaster stories on this thread about encounters with these people. I was a guard at a suburban county jail and the patrolmen brought in a sovereign citizen prisoner. I can't remember what the charge was, but I think it was weapon violations. Oh, and the guy was well into his 60s or 70s. I remember he refused to acknowledge the laws of the state or the county. Because of the stuff he did, like refuse to sign any papers or answer any direct questions, he couldn't officially be booked. And since he couldn't be booked, technically he couldn't be given clothes or food, but the sheriff and mayor made sure he was fed and clothed. Otherwise he was denied all other rights and privileges other prisoners would receive, like mail, phone call, commissary purchases, and eventually visits. The sheriff allowed his wife to visit him in hopes she'd talk some sense into him, but when it became clear that he enjoyed the attention and notoriety he was getting in the local and state press, and among other sovereign citizen groups, by continuing to be obtuse, his visits were cut off, and all his crap also kept him from going before a judge. So he sat in an isolated cell with no books, television, or contact with the outside world for at least a month, maybe more. I left the department before his situation was resolved. The craziest thing is that if he had just played ball, he would have never been jailed. He would have been booked, sat in a holding cell for a few hours, seen a judge, and been released on bail or maybe even his own recognizance. Instead he was jailed indefinitely, and I had the displeasure of interacting with him a couple of times, and he was a squally nut job. After the economic crisis that shook the U.S. in 2008, newspapers and TV reported that squatters/thugs calling themselves sovereign citizens would break into vacant rentals, properties for sale, and especially foreclosed houses. They moved in and claimed ownership. Once discovered and reported to the police, it was a challenge to catch everyone involved, and the properties were often damaged extensively. I despise the banking industry and stock market, but I do feel bad for the individual whom we are was affected.